Hi, this is Philip Pador, founder of NCLEX RN 45-Day Challenge. In this video, I'm going to be talking about leukocytes, or white blood cells. Leukocytes, also known as the white blood cells, are the cells of our immune system that functions to protect and defend our body cells from different types of pathogens. For example, bacterial cells as well as viral agents. Now, just like red blood cells, our white blood cells also come from the same exact stem cells found in the bone marrow of our own body. And these stem cells are known as the hematopoietic stem cells. Now, all white blood cells, or generally speaking, white blood cells can actually differentiate into many different types of specialized white blood cells. As we'll see in just a moment, and all of these specialized white blood cells have their own unique purpose and function. So let's begin by taking a look at the following flowchart, which basically describes the different types of categories of leukocytes. So generally, we can divide leukocytes into three categories. We have the granulocytes, agranulocytes, and the megakaryocytes. And then we can even further subdivide all these categories, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. So leukocyte, the white blood cells, are found circulating in the blood plasma in our lymph system and also in our tissue. And actually, leukocytes are amoeba-like cells. And what that means is like leukocytes can actually move independently of other cells and other structures inside our body. In fact, leukocytes can move against the flow of the blood and the flow of lymph in our vessels. Blood vessels and the lymph vessels of our body. And that's important because leukocytes must be able to move from one location to different locations where that infection is actually taking place. Now, the way that the leukocytes actually move across the capillaries from the blood plasma to that tissue or in reverse is via a process known as diapedesis. And what diapedesis is? It's the movement, it's the squeezing of these leukocytes through the tiny slits and the cervical found between the endothelial cells of our capillaries. So our capillaries consist of this tiny layer of endothelial cells, and between these cells, we have a very tiny holes, and that's where the leukocytes actually move through via the process of diapedesis. Now, let's begin by taking a look at granulocytes. Question number one is, why do we call them granulocytes? Well, we have three different types of granulocytes. Each one of the granulocytes will look very similar under the microscope. The cytoplasms will contain many of these tiny granules as we see in the following diagram. And what these granules are, they are tiny vesicles that contain special chemicals and molecules that are responsible for initiating and carrying out the process of inflammation, which is a process that exists in our innate or non-specific immune system. And we'll see exactly what that means in just a moment. And also, if we examine the nucleus, notice that the nucleus has a shape of a lobe. And that is a distinct characteristic of a granulocyte, which distinguishes granulocytes from agranulocytes, as we'll see in just a moment. So let's take a look at the different divisions of granulocytes. We have three different cell types. We have neutrophils, we have eosinophils, and we have basophils. So let's begin with the neutrophils. Neutrophils are phagocytic cells that can actually seek out, engulf, and destroy different types of pathogens. For example, our bacterial cells. Now, what about your eosinophils? Eosinophils are essentially those cells, those granulocytes that are involved not only in allergic reactions, but also in destroying and killing of parasites and dealing with parasitic infections. And finally, we also have basophils. Now, basophils contain special chemicals, for example, histamine, found within those granules, the secretory vesicles inside the cytoplasm. And these histamines are involved in initiating the process of inflammation, a type of protection that we have in our innate immune system and non-specific immune system. And these histamines are involved in initiating the process of inflammation, a type of the protection that we have in our innate immune system, in the non-specific immune system. Now, our basophils also contain an anti-clotting agent known as heparin. And heparin is very important for basically creating very continuous flow of blood in our blood vessels. So we see that granulocytes are not only involved in the process of inflammation, they are also involved in protecting us from parasitic infections as well as contained in the special cells. Now let's move on to megakaryocytes. So this is what the megakaryocytes actually looks like. And megakaryocytes differentiate into these tiny structures we call platelets. And platelets are also known as thrombocytes. Now these megakaryocytes sides the cytoplasms as well as a tiny portion of our membrane of the megakaryocytes essentially and into these very tiny pieces that we see in the following diagram. So essentially, tiny pieces of the megakaryocytes break down into these platelets, and these are the platelets that we are describing. And basically, when the platelets have nothing but cytoplasm, they don't actually have any nucleus. So when pieces of megakaryocytes break, they form structures called platelets or thrombocytes. Now, what exactly is the functions of our platelets? Well, as the platelets actually move along our blood vessels and some type of cut develops inside our blood vessel, these platelets essentially bind to cut and they begin to aggregate, and in a matter of 5 minutes, they essentially form a temporary patch. And they also create different types of chemicals. They release chemicals that ultimately call other cells into that location. And that helps to patch up the cell that caught within our blood plasma. Now let's move on to a granulocyte. So the big distinction between granulocyte and agranulocyte is that the agranulocyte don't actually have those vesicles, don't actually have those granules, and they also have a spherical or kidney-shaped form of the nucleus. So we see that these are two main differences between the agranulocytes and granulocytes that we might see on the microscope. So these cells, like granules, have spherical or kidney-shaped nuclei. Now we can subdivide a granulocyte into two types. We have the monocytes and we have the lymphocytes. So let's begin by focusing on the monocytes. Now monocytes ultimately differentiate into the macrophages, and macrophages are the largest white blood cells of our body. They're very large phagocytic cells, and these scavenger cells essentially move around our tissues and they seek out our different types of harmful agents, pathogens, bacterial cells, and so forth. They engulf them and then they essentially destroy them. So monocytes enter tissues and develop into macrophages, which are large scavenger cells that engulf pathogens via phagocytosis. So the two types of phagocytic cells inside our immune systems are macrophages as well as the neutrophils. But macrophages are much larger than the neutrophils. Now let's move on to our lymphocytes. So lymphocytes are those specialized white blood cells that make our specific immune system. So remember, we have three different types of lymphocytes. We have the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes, but we also have the natural killer cells, which basically looks something like this. Now, the natural killer cells are those cells that essentially bind to antigens on other cells, and they can either kill or infected cells, or they can kill off cancer cells. So we see that the natural killer cells seek out and destroy infected cells that have been infected by the same type of virus. And they also kill off cancer cells. Now what about the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes? Let's begin with the B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes are those cells of our antibody-mediated response system of our adapter or acquired immune system. So these B lymphocytes are essentially responsible for creating antibodies. These proteins that essentially travel inside our blood system and which help playing important role in actually protecting us from infection. So B lymphocytes are cells that are part of the antibody mediator response system. They further differentiate into the plasma cells as well as the memory cells. Now plasma cells, although is a B lymphocyte that produce the antibodies, and the memory cells are those cells that essentially store those antibodies and help us from protecting us from reinfection. So if some bacterial cells infected us once, it's the memory cells that essentially protect us the second time those same cell types will infect us. Now, what about the T lymphocytes? So the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes basically looks something like this. We have our membrane, and on the membrane, we have these different types of proteins that act as receptors for antigens. They can actually bind on the antigens found on the cell membranes of bacterial cells or infected cells, and that can essentially destroy these pathogens when these cells are bind into them. So we have 4 different types of T lymphocytes or T cells. So we have the helper T cells, killer T cells, memory T cells, and the suppressor T cells. So let's begin with the helper T cells. So helper cells basically release special types of chemicals into the surrounding blood or the surrounding lymph, and they help all their cells. Other immune cells actually mature into their specialized form. We also have the killer T cells, not to be confused with the natural killer cells. These 2 cells are 2 different types of cells. So killer T cells are responsible for using their protein membrane-bound protein found in the cell membrane, so basically seek out special types of pathogens and kill off those pathogens by releasing a special type of chemical into those pathogen cells. Now, what about the memory T cells? Well, memory T cells basically function the same way that the memory B cells functions. They help protect us from reinfection. And finally, we have the suppressor cells. And these suppressor cells are responsible for suppressing and regulating our immune system. And we'll discuss how this actually takes place in the next several actions. So this is a brief introduction through the different types of the white blood cells found inside our immune system.